Hello, and thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Optimising Human Performance podcast. I'm Martin Jones.
And I'm John Paul Nevin. In this episode, we're talking to physician, psychologist and academic Dr. Nathalie Pattyn about human performance in selected populations, from astronauts to Antarctic expedition crews.
It's very disturbing for everybody because you're isolated but you're never alone, which is a very bizarre combination.
We discuss the importance of rest and recovery in training.
Quite often, we focus in these types of programs on allowing people to be more, to grow stronger, to grow faster, to grow more efficient. And to me, that is a huge blind spot because that is already what these people have been doing their whole lives. So one of the most valuable things you can share with them is the relevance of rest, recovery, replenishing resources, because that is what is usually missing in this story.
We explore the role of robustness and why it's disappearing across society.
People talk about resilience, which is how long does it take you to stand back up when you've been taken down, but we never talk about robustness. And robustness is how much can you take before you break down.
And we take a look at the challenges of leadership in high-performance settings.
No human being is certain of everything at all times. Showing people when you don't know something makes them more confident in your answers when you do know something. And that builds trust. If people trust you, they will work to belong. Because basically, that's what everybody wants.
Hi, Nathalie. Welcome to the Optimising Human Performance podcast. Can you tell us who you are, where you are, and how you got to where you are?
So I'm, by training, a medical doctor and a psychologist. I did my medical school through defense. So I've been with defense for 30 years now. And during medical school, I thought there was an area that was really under-taught and under-mentioned, and it was how people think, how they make decisions, how their brain works. And that's why I studied psychology in parallel to actually fill that gap. And I went on in my clinical specialty to do emergency medicine, and I pursued my quest for how people think with a PhD on cognitive performance in operational circumstances, and more specifically in astronauts and jet fighter pilots. And so I kept working as a military emergency physician, so being deployed. And in parallel, I kept that research work ongoing in operational populations. And in 2010, I started my own research unit at the Royal Military Academy in Belgium. And that research unit, Viper, was actually targeting the study of human performance in operational environment and more specifically niche populations. You know, the people who are selected because of exceptional cognitive and or physical abilities like jet fighter pilots, like astronauts, like special forces operators, any function where you have few personnel, so it doesn't get studied a lot, but that has to meet very specific challenges.
Excellent. So that Viper unit that you set up, can you give us an idea of the type of research that Viper have done? Like what sort of research program is conducted in your research group?
One very applied example was the way we designed the human performance program for our special forces group, which was basically taking what we knew from existing literature, taking what we knew from experience, and then performing additional research to make sure that the program was tailored to the needs of the individuals. So that's a very applied research question. On the other end of the spectrum, you have much more, let's say, mechanistic research to understand how our system works regarding adaptation, for example, to Antarctic overwintering, where people are sent to Antarctica for anything between 1 year and 18 months, and looking at what it does with physiology, and more specifically sleep physiology and circadian rhythms, mood and adaptation in general.
So Natalie, if you could re-engineer someone for an extreme role, so may that be an astronaut, someone who operates in an isolated, confined extreme environment, or a military operator, what would you change first? How would you approach it?
You mean regarding selection, training?
Let's say training. Let's focus on that aspect.
Well, for those roles, the luxury you have is that you work with highly selected individuals. So that already makes things easier because motivation and ability are a given. And then what you usually need to work on with this type of individuals is not necessarily enhance their capacities, because that's something they want to do so much by themselves. You don't need to push that. What you need is actually act as an enabler to provide the relevant tools, the relevant support to enable them to be their best selves. And quite often we focus in these types of programs on allowing people to be more, to grow stronger, to grow faster, to grow more efficient. And to me, that is a huge blind spot, because that is already what these people have been doing their whole lives. So one of the most valuable things you can share with them is the relevance of rest, recovery, rebuilding, replenishing resources, because that is what is usually missing in this story. And also because usually when you start working with that type of population, they are at a peak in performance, meaning they've just been selected. If they've just been selected, it means they've been training, sometimes for years, not only physically, but in all possible aspects of what they've been selected upon. So they are at a peak. And you cannot stay at the peak. It is physiologically impossible. Any systems engineer will tell you that performance of any given system fluctuates. So you get people at the peak, and you have to prevent them crashing or burning down. And that is a really, really big challenge, because on the one hand, you have people and organizations that want to at least keep that peak performance or even enhance it. And on the other hand, you have just the reality of how systems work, be it physiology, psychology. And there's a concept that we talk very little of when we talk about human performance, and it's robustness. People talk about resilience, which is how long does it take you to stand back up when you've been taken down? But we never talk about robustness. And robustness is how much can you take before you break down. I'm going to make a sidestep here to a more societal view. If you think back to the COVID-19 pandemic, this is what showed us that as a society, we have lost robustness. And that is because of optimization. Because optimization is actually taking out, trimming, pruning. But it also means that you get rid of your contingency margins of resources that are not utilized. And if you get rid of those, you get rid of the buffer that allows you to take an unexpected blow. And that's often the comparison that is made between Tier 1 special operations unit, be it military or police, and athletes. Because, when we talk about the tactical athletes in those populations, we often use concepts from exercise physiology, training psychology, sports psychology, and so on and so forth. But the difference between an actual athlete and a tactical athlete is that an actual athlete has a very predictable life. Whereas what you expect from a tactical athlete is the ability to take whatever comes his or her way. And that's something very different. And that's why we have to be mindful of that robustness concept. If I take it back to my PhD work, where I investigated physiological indicators from the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, I thought it was really interesting that in physiological research, most of the work has been done on the sympathetic nervous system. The stress hormones, the mobilization of resources, and so on and so forth. And when you look at the overall functioning of an individual, this is a very crucial ability to mobilize these resources. But in terms of the amount of time that you're going to do it, it's a very little percentage of your time. And yet we've started to look at performance in that optimal arousal point kind of way, where you're like, hang on, we want people to function in a way in terms of resource mobilization, energy expenditure, that is actually only sustainable if you do it like 5% of the time, tops. Whereas the parasympathetic nervous system, deemed far less interesting for decades, is actually what allows you to replenish those resources and to keep your system functioning well. It's the maintenance process. It's the thing without which you're going to break down and burn out.
That's music to my ears, Natalie. That's one of the most challenging things that I face, is trying to help people understand the value of recovery. And I'm not sure I do it particularly well because people still working very, very hard, physically training very, very hard, and it maybe undervalue rest, recovery, and sleep. I mean, how do we convince people? How do we show people that rest and recovery is valuable, it is essential? Have you got any stories, any experiences of how you've helped people really understand that this is an essential component of their training, of their optimization?
So basically, what you want is to create an experience that will convince them. Because conveying rational elements will not change people's behavior, as everybody knows. Because otherwise, physicians wouldn't smoke anymore. And a lot of physicians smoke. Education is part of it, because of course you have to tell people why. But basically, what I find works best is if you are able, working with people, to create some sort of natural experiment where you demonstrate that value. And I'm going to take the example of a PTI I worked with, who was really, really good at that. And he tried to explain to people that actually, if you want to train to enhance your performance, the way people usually train is they go as hard as they can for as long as they can. And he was like, no, 80% of the time you need to build up the base of what you have, which means training at 60%, sometimes 80% of your capacity, not 100%. That has to be like the exception. And of course, you can explain that to people. And then you can say, you know what, I'm going to go with you on a specific technical training in an altitude environment. And I'm going to do everything with you. And I'm going to demonstrate to you that my approach works. And that's what he did. He embedded himself into one of our teams and did that for 3 weeks. Now, of course, who was able to do that? I wouldn't be able to do that. It takes some basic requirements to be able to demonstrate that approach. But when they came back after 3 weeks, the guy were absolutely convinced. Okay, this works. And you can do the same with sleep. Sleep is a funny one because, of course, telling people in that kind of population, you have to sleep 8 hours every night doesn't go down well. But what you can do with something as simple as a sleep diary, working with people for several weeks, you can demonstrate how they can actually make sure that the sleep they get, even if it's not 8 hours a night, is more restorative. And if they feel the effects, then you've won them over. So no, there's no easy answer.
That's a shame. I was hoping you were going to give me the shortcut, the easy answer, but yeah.
So Natalie, I'm just going to expand upon this a little bit further, and I'm going to hit you a two-part question here, and it's going to swing both ends of the spectrum. So first off, from the applied perspective, what would you recommend in regards to restorative techniques? Sleep's obviously going to be one, that's pretty important, but what other techniques would be important? And then switching the pendulum to the other side, if we're talking about enhancing robustness, what sort of techniques can be potentially utilised to make our people more robust?
Well, actually, I think a lot of these answers overlap. And the bad news is, as for the previous question, there's no free lunch and it takes time. And that's the trick with restorative techniques, like, for example, mindfulness and breathing techniques. They are skills, and a skill can only be utilized properly if you master it. And you can only master a skill if you have practiced it. And so if you've read about breathing techniques and you thought, I'm going to keep this in the back of my head and it might come in handy one day. It's not going to do anything at all. If you've read about meditation, it won't do you any good. It's a skill. So if you don't practice it, even as little as 10 minutes a day, you won't experience any benefits from it. And that's the tricky bit, because these are very easy to implement. They are tried and tested, but it's hard to get people to commit over a long period of time, because it takes time before you see any effect. It's not a magic wand. And robustness is the same thing. It takes time to build. And that's quite often when I work with certain groups to actually enhance either well-being or performance or robustness. What I find and what you very rapidly bump into is that what limits you is not the willingness of people to try out new things. It's that it's going to conflict with external constraints they have no control over. And then you realize that it becomes a management issue rather than a medical or performance issue. And that is why to have any kind of lasting impact, you have to have absolute support from leadership.
Can we go back to selection? I know your group has done a really interesting piece of research that you recently published around some of the variables that can predict selection success. Do you have any pearls of wisdom around how do we select the right people? What are we looking for?
I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I think one of the most essential things is time. And this is something that has come up in the media with the current news cycle about the issues on the South African Antarctic station. It came out in March, and March is the beginning of the overwintering period in Antarctica. So basically, it's when the team of people that are going to spend approximately 9 months together, isolated from everything and everywhere, where they settle into the routine of running the whole thing. And what happened there is that the crew issued a distress call saying they didn't feel safe with one particular crew member because of his behavior, threats he had issued, harassment behavior he had shown. And then people ask questions like, but aren't these people screened and selected? And the answer is maybe, but there's only so much you can do with screening and selection. Psychologists, despite what popular imagination may think, don't have a crystal ball and don't see through everything. And that is why, if you look at selection processes for critical functions, for example, the way we train our medical doctors, the way astronauts are selected and then trained for a very long time, 3 years is like the basic. The way special forces operators are selected very rigorously and then trained, the basic training, it takes at least 6 months before they can call themselves an operator, and then they have to acquire new skills as well. And there's a reason for that. It's not only the complexity of the content these people have to master, it is because that period of training also serves as an ongoing evaluation of your character, attitude, personality, and basically how you deal with the very specific challenges of the job. And I want to break a lance here for expert judgments and thus subjectivity. Because in this day and age of accountability, everything needs to be measurable and objective. And yet, if you have several senior experts in all the fields we've mentioned that tell you that person is not going to cut the mustard, it's not going to work. And of course, you need several because subjectivity inherently holds a lot of biases. But let's not throw away the baby with the bathwater. Yes, you have biases, and there are ways to actually bypass those. But expert judgment still remains, let's say, the most reliable source of evaluation of something that you can't quite put your finger on. Like, is this the right person for this job? And we're talking about the physician who will or will not save your kid's life after a very severe trauma. We're talking about the astronaut that may or may not deal with a fire on board the space station. Or we're talking about the operator leading a team of hostage rescue that will or will not save your life if you're in danger. And so when we look at these very, very critical functions, despite the fact that we would like to make everything as objective and as measurable and as accountable as possible, at some point, if we refuse the responsibility of the expert judgment, then we're making a huge mistake.
110% agree on that one. That's for sure. People too quick to try and put a number on something and forgetting that subjective art. Now, I'm going to ping a question here to you, and it's working about this idea of time, but I'm going to take it to the other end of the training pipeline and looking at military organisations specifically. So within many Western militaries, there is a driver to optimise the training pipeline. And by that, they're trying to make it cheaper. That's the bottom line. And they're trying to shorten that training pipeline. Yet, they are recruiting from a population which is more sedentary in nature than ever before. When they enter the training pipeline, they're at a lower fitness standard. Yet, they're expected within a shorter time frame to get to the previous standard which is accepted. And what often happens is individuals go through that pipeline, they don't reach the standard, and then we have a liability which is then passed on to units, and units have to address that liability, which you could argue the toss will impact upon operational effectiveness if a unit is due to deploy. Therefore, going along the theme you've been discussing, do you think, given the reality of say, a population group which is more sedentary than ever before, and the skills and the broader spectrum of skills which we arguably need to train our individuals in, should the training pipeline be longer? Should we have an elongated training pipeline which gets people to the standard instead of trying to cut corners and optimise?
Yes.
Good answer.
Boom.
As I said, optimization is the way to vulnerability. If you want to attain a goal with spending as little resources as possible, you're just going to create more attrition. And so I also know that this is a big issue in military organizations, that they want to reduce attrition, but it's an impossible equation. You have standards of the goal you want to reach, you have time, and you have money. And it's a trade-off. You can't have the three of them. You can't have it short, cheap, and good. You can have it good and fast, but it will cost a lot of money. You can have it good and cheaper, not good and cheap, but then it will take more time. And you can have it fast and cheaper, but then it will be bad. There's no way around it.
Yeah.
A long question and a beautifully short answer. There you go. I love that.
No, that was poetic.
I want to go back to your question, Martin,
Okay.
because there's one thing I didn't mention about selection and the last paper we published about that, because that's something that I felt a bit uncomfortable with, the way when you publish a scientific results and then it starts to lead its own life, and then the operational community takes it and starts to look at ways of applying and implementing things. And in this case, I wish I had written some warning in the discussion or the conclusion of that paper about when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And that's the hidden side effect of trying to find indicators to measure the quality of a certain process. Because, of course, human nature is that people will try and chase the indicator rather than the quality of the process that you intended to measure to begin with. And I'm saying that specifically with regard to our research related to the IQ results, which were highly significant, and this wasn't surprising at all for anybody in the community. But then people started to ask me, okay, how can we implement it? And I was like, well, that's going to be tricky, because as soon as you implement it as a fixed feature of selection, candidates will know about it. And of course, they will prepare for it. And that's the drawback of any cognitive test in selection, is that, well, soon you will have online versions of those tests for people to practice them. And then, of course, you lose its intrinsic value, which was to be a proxy for intelligence. And it will just become a test per se that will measure motivation of people with regard to how well they prepared for it. And that's the drawback here. It was valid because it was not used in a selection context. It was used to actually design the human performance program. And so people participated in good faith to give us as much information as possible to design a program that would support them, which is a totally different mindset from I'm actually trying to ace this test because that's one of the things standing between my goal and me. So that's the caveat I would put in there.
Yeah, it was a great paper. And I echo what you just said then, because a few people have asked me that similar question, like, do we now put this in some kind of test? So I'm glad you've discussed that, because I can just say, listen to this podcast and you get a much better answer than I can give you. Can we go back to Antarctica? Obviously, I know you spent a lot of time in Antarctica over the years. Could you explain how that came around? Like, what were you doing down south?
That is a very good question, Martin. One that I've asked myself many times. So my first mission to Antarctica was as the physician of one of the building expeditions of the Belgian station, Princess Elizabeth Station. It was as a military physician. And while I was there, I wanted to perform research. And that's why I thought, well, it's going to be light all the time because it was in summer. Let's look at sleep and circadian rhythm and mood and performance of people who stay there. We've been doing this for 18 years now. We've collected data almost every year ever since, and we have the largest data set of sleep recordings and circadian hormone measurements on the continent. It also sparked with me a passion for medicine in austere and remote environments, because I found it fascinating, the difference between how I operated as an emergency physician in a hospital in Brussels, in Belgium, one of the richest countries in the world, one of the most industrialized, where you have a very dense network of care. It's an absolutely foreign concept to think of delayed evacuations and lack of resources, and then practicing in an environment where, yeah, you might get an evacuation, but you don't know when. It will be heavily weather dependent, and we're talking days, and where you don't have all the resources, and basically you have to make do with what you have. And to me, that was a very refreshing tick in my medical practice. We are educated as physicians to work in a very resource-rich environment, and especially in the last decade, to cover our asses when it comes to responsibility and medical legal aspects. And I find this as a very sad evolution, where you actually order clinical tests and examinations to be able to have a tangible proof that the result was negative. And so that if anything happens, it's not your responsibility, because that's not good medicine. It's not good medicine for the patients. It's not good medicine for the society who has to pay for that. And so it was really a very pure kind of medicine, where you have your clinical judgment, you have to be resourceful, you have to be inventive, and you have to call a friend quite quickly if things go sour, because you can't solve it all on your own.
What was it like in terms of the daily functioning? Like, how does living and working in these isolated, confined, extreme environments like Antarctica, like space flight, I guess, like being in a submarine, like, how do those environments affect people's cognitive and emotional functioning and well-being?
Well, it's very disturbing for everybody, no matter what your personality type, no matter whether you're an extrovert or an introvert, because you're isolated, but you're never alone, which is a very bizarre combination. So you're isolated from the people you would choose to spend time with, but you're forced to spend a lot of time with people you didn't choose, which is an interesting conundrum. And again, you have to make do with what you have. You have to be patient. And I think the adjustment will become more and more difficult, because in our society, we live in an age of immediacy. Everything is at your fingertips at all times. And when you're in such an environment, basically it's not. Really not. And there's nothing you can do. There's no money you can throw at it that will solve that issue. And so I think adapting to that will become more and more difficult for people who evolved and were educated in this age of immediacy.
Natalie, from your own experiences, did you sort of identify any traits in individuals who were better suited for those environments?
Of course, humility, because it's also something when you see the polarization of opinions due to communication on social networks, when you see how people do not communicate easily in real life anymore, like having a debate with someone is becoming difficult. And in those environments, you have to solve tensions, frictions, conflicts, wherever you are on the scale, and preferably sooner rather than later. And the only way to solve it is to talk to people and to be willing to compromise. And this is something that is required less and less in current society, because it's something that you can keep at bay with virtual interactions. You can interrupt a virtual interaction whenever you want. You can't do that if you live with 10 people on an isolated base. Yeah, you can lock yourself up in your room, but that is dysfunctional behavior, both for yourself and for the group. And so I find there's a bigger and bigger gap between those environments and the society we live in. And so to come back to your traits, I think humility, and this is something that is described brilliantly by Chris Hadfield, the Canadian astronaut. One of the books he wrote is An Astronaut's Guide to Life on Earth. It's a brilliant book because he's very candid about his evolution from top-notch jet fighter pilot, really like the caricature of the high performer overachiever, who was then selected to be an astronaut and who thought, I'm going to ace it, with the same behavior that worked before. And then realized, hang on, it's not the same ball game. And he writes about it and he has a beautiful saying for it. And it is how I learned to be a zero. Because he said in everything until then in my career, I wanted to be more. I wanted to be an added value to a team, to be noticed somehow, to stand out. And he said, well, sometimes in a team, the best you can do is go unnoticed. Be good at your work, but go unnoticed. Because the definition of a well-functioning team, a well-functioning system, is when you don't notice the components, when everything runs smoothly, and then you don't wonder about which cog or which peg did what. And I found that a beautiful description because it's very, very true. When you find yourself relying on team performance, it's absolutely incompatible with chasing your ego.
It sort of reminds me of Legacy, the book about the All Blacks and the 15 tenets that sort of underpin their performance, but they're a team, a collective. And that sort of mirrors what you were saying there, which is really, really fascinating.
Nathalie, can we go back to your PhD research that you mentioned earlier around the psychophysiological tools to measure performance? What was that about? Can you explain what you mean by a psychophysiological tool and describe what you actually studied at the time?
Well, the idea of using both physiology and psychology, and especially how they integrate, is because we still don't have any gold standard, any direct measurement of how people think. So look at decision making, look at emotion regulation. We can look at the outcome of these processes, but we don't have any brain scanner that will show us exactly the path from A to B to C as to how it happens. And so when you can't measure something directly, what you can do, and what has been done in psychology for decades, if not centuries, is look at different indicators that are related to the process you want to study. And so with regard to cognitive performance, I looked at the output of cognitive tests, but we're looking at a population that was selected based on cognitive abilities. So you can't measure those people with the same instruments than those that are used to measure normal populations in a statistical term, or even tests that were designed to screen for deficits. And so one part of the research was to design tools that were sensitive enough to actually measure variations in performance in a population that is selected and trained to have the most stable performance you can imagine. And then another idea was to look at physiology, saying when you measure the outcome of a cognitive task, it's an outcome. But what are the processes at play? You can't measure transmission of information directly in the brain, but what you can measure is the level of balance of sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And that gives you a clue with regard to where this person is in terms of energy mobilization. Because if you reach a certain outcome with throwing in everything you have with zero buffer left, or if you reach that certain outcome at a comfortable level of performance, hence being robust, because you have some more energy to mobilize if you can, that is a totally different story for exactly the same outcome. You know, it's the same rationale when PTI and strength and conditioning coaches measure heart rate in people while instructing them to do a time trial, for example. It's like, well, if a young person reaches a maximum heart rate of 160 versus another one who reaches a maximum heart rate of 190, maybe one gave more than the other. It's why we measure lactate curves in VO2 max trials. Because if you don't see the kink, it's like, no, you didn't give it up. You kept in your comfort zone. It was the exact same idea. And of course, it had to be measurable ambulatory on board the space station. So that rules out a whole range of more sophisticated or more invasive techniques. And so I went with cardiorespiratory recordings, where you measure ECG and respiration. And I very much enjoyed James Nestor's book, Breath, because it put the focus back on respiration, which has been ignored in psychophysiology for ages. And it's actually a very, very sensitive indicator. It's a more sensitive indicator to stress than heart rate, for example, because people will adapt their breathing rate before you can see significant changes in heart rate. And so with ECG and breathing, I had very simple measures in terms of logistics, but if you analyze them properly with good signal analysis and not just having the commercial off-the-shelf tool of your quantified watch, where you can't do any raw data quality check, but if you have the raw signals and you analyze them with a whole range of signal analysis and statistical tools, you can actually extract a lot of information from them.
That's great to hear. I've been exposed to quite a few technologies that supposedly, how do I put this, read your mind effectively. It's like you strap something to your head and they can measure a signal and it can give you a score on a cognitive outcome. You know, you are 50 out of 100 in your creativity or your decision making. Now, I've got an opinion of these sorts of these technologies. I wonder, have you seen this sort of stuff? Is it viable, or is this an example of what JP likes to call the snake oil salesman?
Yes. So another month goes by without a request landing in my inbox from some department or the other within defense saying, hey, look, we found this tool. We would like to buy this for our personnel. What do you think of it? Do you know Brandolini's law, which states that basically it takes minutes to spread bullshit and it takes hours to debunk it? Well, that is one of the curses of my life, because then I have to write very lengthy mails saying it won't work because of this and this and this and that. And I'm happy to come and talk to you about it. But really, if you want to spend some money on the performance of your people, there are better ways to spend it. And the problem is we live in a very technology-hungry society where people will spend fortunes on nutritional supplements. But if you ask them, are you eating 5 fruit and veg a day? Which sounds like the most lame advice you can give. And yet, you'd be surprised at how many people don't eat 5 fruit and veg a day, but spend £100 a month on supplements. It's like, well, it's kind of putting a very, very nice icing on a very, very cheap and bad cake.
I like that. I'm going to use that one in the future. Your cake looks awful, but your icing's lovely.
I think I would have a profanity for the cake,
there you
but
go.
hell.
I'm a classy guy, JP. I wouldn't do such things.
No, wait, at the other end of the spectrum, are there any emerging technologies which you've seen which you think, right, these may have a positive impact upon monitoring, readiness, fatigue measures, that we could apply this real world and it might just make a change?
The one thing that might have an actual impact is transcranial stimulation, direct magnetic stimulation of certain brain areas. The problem is, because of the promising experimental results, commercial applications have been designed which have cut so many corners, it's not valid anymore. So if you talk to the people who actually researched this and are experts in this, and this is something I've done because it looked so promising, they tell you, yeah, it will work if you do a morphological scan before, because every brain morphology is different. You identify for that specific person the exact area for that function, and then you design a protocol that will target that area for that specific person. No commercial application does that. Let's not forget that we're talking about an edge of 1% here. And so these are not massive effects. And if you don't respect the boundary conditions, you lose the very, very fine edge that this might give you. And there is no situation that I've encountered in operational populations where I was required to formulate an advice regarding emerging technologies and where the basics were done right, which is something that infuriates me. Because it's like, well, first get your basics right. Make sure your people rest and sleep enough, have decent food, have proper physical activity, not just hammering them with mindless runs of endless strength and conditioning, but like proper activity tailored to the individual, to his or her vulnerabilities, because in those populations you very rarely have intact people. Just like in top athletes, there is no top athlete that doesn't have a recurring musculoskeletal injury, a vulnerability, a beaten ankle, a knee, a certain muscle. And so make sure you target those. And once you have all this in place, then we can talk about icing, but not before.
And I'll shout out your book at this point, Nathalie, because there's an excellent chapter on there that mentions the shiny object syndrome in there. So anyone interested, we'll put the link to your book in the show notes, which is open access, so anyone can read it as well. So anyone's interested, get hold of the handbook of, what was it called? You tell us the full title, Nathalie.
The Handbook of Mental Performance, despite the fact that I despise this title. Because to me, it goes against the idea of robustness. But if it's what everybody else is calling it, then you have to use that term. But basically, it would be more of a plead against mental performance.
If we could move on slightly to leadership, we've sort of mentioned before that leaders do play an important role in this discussion. It's all well and good human performance practitioners or experts in these fields saying, this is a good idea, you need to do this. But if leadership isn't building a culture around good nutrition, good sleep, rest, recovery, adequate physical activity, social connections, financial health, whatever it is, not much happens. So if you were working with a leader of an organization, what do you tell them? And how do you win them over?
Well, first I tell them I sympathize because they have a very hard role, because basically they're caught between a rock and a hard place. Because they are subjected to the pressures of the organization. And if they want to be a good leader for their people, what they need to be is basically a very large umbrella to shield people from any undue pressure and unreasonable demands and counterproductive constraints. And so it's a very, very hard position. And if they're willing to take on that hardship, then they need actually to give themselves the same thing they give their personnel, which is the same basics for performance in terms of rest and recovery, the pillars of health and everything. And one thing to me that sets really great leaders apart is their realization of their duty of care. And I had a very interesting discussion once with an army officer. I had to sit in a staff officer jury with him, and he was, by any account, the caricature of the hardcore army guy, no frills and no touchy-feely bullshit. And so I was like, okay, this is going to be interesting. And one of the theses we had to evaluate was about the implementation of a specific role in deployed units, which was an advisor in mental operationality. And it was something between a psychologist and a social worker. And he said, well, to me, this is complete bullshit. And I was like, oh, yeah, now we're having it. And I have to admit, I was completely wrong, because what he said next was one of the smartest things I've heard on the topic, because he said, this to me is a failure of the system, because this is leaders outsourcing their responsibility for the mental well-being of their personnel. And that is very true. So that duty of care is absolutely essential. And then the next one is authenticity, because too often leaders think they have to show certainty at all times, but no human being is certain of everything at all times. And so showing people when you don't know something makes them more confident in your answers when you do know something. And that builds trust. If people trust you, they will be honest and they will work to belong. Because basically, that's what everybody wants. If you look at the basic human needs, it's belonging, it's autonomy, the valorization, the acknowledgement of competency. So if, as a leader, you can be authentic about your own vulnerabilities, it will make people trust you. It will make your life comfortable, because holding up a facade requires an inordinate amount of mental energy. And so it will be excellent for your well-being as a leader. And so those two things, if a leader shows these features, then it's God's gift to humanity to work with him or with her for enhancing well-being and performance in his or her personnel.
I love that. I was involved in an interview recently, and one of the candidates showed that sort of vulnerability. They didn't know the answer, wasn't able to give me an answer. And they came out and said it. They were very honest, they were very open. And it really struck me as that's the kind of person that I want to work with. There was something about that moment that really struck me. Yeah, this is really powerful. I like this person because of the way that they responded. So yeah, really good to hear. If we start to wrap this up, if people want to follow you and learn about you and what you're up to, what's the best way that they can do that?
Well, I have to admit, I don't make it a priority to communicate and to give outreach, because as a scientist, you need knowledge, know-how, and you need to make people aware of your knowledge and know-how. And that is a full-time job in SAE. And so I try to publish regularly to share it with the scientific community. We try to publish open access whenever we can to actually make everything we do accessible for everybody. And then luckily, some people put a lot of time and energy in making brilliant podcasts like yourselves. And then once in a while, I get to summarize the rationale behind our work.
I'll challenge you there. We're neither brilliant nor do we spend much time. We cuff every episode on it.
No cuff too tough.
The Viper website, has that got your publications for the research lab? Could we share that one? Let people know about your research via that link.
Yeah, there is a link that is kept updated through the Royal Military Academy website. about all our publications and our work.
That's great. Great. We'll make sure that goes in the show notes. And the final thing that we like to do on the podcast is to wrap up by allowing you to have the final words. And that can be something that you want to reiterate or reinforce, or maybe something that we've not talked about yet that's particularly important. So Nathalie, a big thank you from me. I say this a lot on these podcasts, but I genuinely learn tons from you, like I always do whenever we have any interactions. It's shaped my career in more ways than you'll probably ever know. So thank you very, very much for that. Over to you. How would you like to wrap this episode up?
Well, thank you, Martin. That's really touching what you're saying. I would wrap it up by saying, if you want to talk about performance, there's no free lunch. There's no magic wand, and you have to sweat the small stuff, because otherwise it doesn't work.
That's great. Nathalie, thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Nat.
Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of the Optimizing Human Performance podcast. Thanks for tuning in, and if you found this valuable, take a moment to rate and review the podcast. If you know someone who'd benefit from today's conversation, then please share this with them. We're always keen to hear your thoughts. If you have feedback, guest suggestions, or topics that you'd love us to cover, then email us at info@ophp.co.uk or connect with us on LinkedIn. Until next time, keep striving, keep improving, and keep optimizing your performance.